I know what you're probably thinking. You saw the title of this video and thought, full 3 style in a week? What kind of clickbait is this? But I promise that this video is not clickbait, and in this video, I'll do my best to explain how I was able to learn all 778 commutators in just 7 days. But before we begin, I'd like to mention that there are exactly 3 of you who are not subscribed. So yeah, I'm talking to you. If you're not subscribed, then press the subscribe button so you're not one of those 3. So just as a quick disclaimer, I'm not pretending to be the best blind solver in the world or the most qualified to make a tutorial. This video isn't even a tutorial, but rather just documenting how I learned 3 style. Before I can actually explain how I learned 3 style, I have to explain what it is. I'm going to keep this section pretty short, and if you want a more in-depth explanation, 4Blind has a really good video which I will link in the description and up here if I can make that work. 3 style is an advanced blind solving method that all the top blinders use. Beginner methods like M2 or Old Bachman use algorithms to solve one piece at a time. For example, if I wanted to solve this case using Old Bachman going from my UBL buffer to here, then I would have to do something like this, and that solves that. 3 style solves 2 pieces at a time with shorter algs, cycling 3 pieces around and solving 2 of them. This is the same case as earlier, and I can solve it like this, which is obviously much faster and like a quarter of the amount of moves. This means that the execution potential for 3 style is much higher than with beginner methods, and you can get much faster with it. The algorithms used to solve any cycle of 3 pieces are fairly short and are very easy to understand at an intuitive level. This is why 3 style can be learned so quickly. The 778 commutators aren't really algorithms in the traditional sense where you have to break an algorithm down into triggers and then memorize it and then do it over and over again until it's in your muscle memory, but they're rather just formulaic and they're much easier to learn. It's similar to F2L. When you're first learning F2L, you don't memorize the algorithms for all 41 different F2L cases because that's a lot for a beginner. Instead, you learn the basic inserts like RU R prime or RU prime R prime, and then you learn how to set up any case of 2 F2L pieces into one of those basic inserts that you already know, like this. 3 style is the same concept. You learn basic ideas like pure commutators, such as this, which is very simple, and then you learn how to set up other cases into those basic commutators that you already know. So with a method as complicated as 3 style, where do you even begin? I started by watching 4Blind's 3 style tutorial, which I will link in the description. It really explains how and why a commutator works and gives nice visuals to support his explanation. I'd highly recommend that anyone who wants to learn 3 style start with this because it really helped me a lot to get an intuitive understanding of comms. After watching that, I understood how commutators worked and could solve any pure comm that didn't require setup moves. For example, this one, you can solve it without having to set up any of these pieces because there's already an interchange and an insertion. And same goes for something like this comm. This is a pure comm and it's very simple. However, a very large portion of 3 style does require setup moves and they can be really tricky to learn. For example, in this case we're going from UFR down to here and up here. You cannot solve this with a pure commutator unless you want to do something like triple sexy here. But yeah, don't do that please, that's really bad. So instead, to solve something like this, you'd have to use a setup move. For this specific case, the setup would be R, D prime, R, and that sets up this corner over to here. And this is much easier and can be solved with a pure commutator. And then you just undo the setup. So most people think that learning all of the setup moves for 3 style is much harder than just learning the pure comms themselves because these are pretty simple, anyone can do them. But I couldn't be bothered to learn how to do all of the setups on my own, so that's where JPerm's tutorials come in. His tutorials put commutators in groups in which each group uses similar setups. This is really important because instead of having to remember how every single case is set up, I could just look at what group the case is from and I could solve any case from that group. For example, I'm going to use the commutator that I used a second ago. This one is part of the group where you have 2 targets on the top face and then 1 target on the bottom face. And any commutator that looks like this, you can solve using a pretty simple step method thing, where you just make sure that there's nothing above this corner. There's nothing above the individual corner in which there's nothing there. And then you can just use 3 moves to take it out and kind of change the orientation, so now it's much easier to solve. And that kind of like logic and that setup can be applied to any case that has 2 corners on the top and 1 on the bottom. So JPerm's tutorial grouped every single commutator into groups, in which each group had like a way to solve it. And that made it much easier to learn, because instead of having to learn every single commutator, I could just learn the groups. So I learned both edges and corners from his tutorials and could now solve either of them individually. So something like this, I could solve this and this, because this is corners only and this is edges only. I was also able to solve these like blindfolded individually, but I couldn't do a full solve because of a thing called parity. Parity is essentially when you have 2 edges and 2 corners swapped after solving everything else. I can't use a 3 cycle to solve edges because there's only 2 edges that need to be swapped. And I can't use a 3 cycle to solve corners because there's only 2 corners that need to be swapped, and I can't do that with a 3 cycle, obviously. So instead we do something called parity, which is when you do 2 edges and 2 corner swaps. There's 21 algorithms from this if you just use normal parity, which I do. And most of them are just setups to PLLs, which makes them pretty easy to learn. But it's just something about 3 blinds that you have to deal with. So for this parity case, we have to swap these 2 and this to there, and I can just do this alg. And so, after learning 440 edge commutators, 378 edge commutators, and 21 parity algs, I could finally say that I knew full 3 style. But I sucked. My first full 3 style blind solve was 4.5 minutes, which I got after 16 DNFs. So why was it so slow when I'm using the same method as the best blind solvers in the world? Full 3 style isn't enough to become fast at 3 blind, or any blind for that matter. There's obviously the memorization and think ahead aspects of it, which I'm pretty bad at, having not practiced in over a year. But then there's also how fast you can execute an individual commutator. This is where speed optimal 3 style comes into play. The 3 style that I'm using right now is very primitive and isn't really speed optimized. A lot of intuitive comms use very unergonomic finger tricks such as S2 or home grip B. Making the analogy to F12 once again, I'm using intuitive beginner F2L. And similarly to how slower intuitive cases in F2L are replaced by faster algorithms, the same goes for 3 style. The slower commutators are gradually replaced by less intuitive ones, or just pure algorithms, which you just have to memorize. You can execute these much faster than the intuitive comm, and this is what the top 3 blinders do. Most of their comms aren't purely intuitive anymore, but are speed optimized. For example, here we have this edge comm where we're going from UF to LU, UF to LU to RD. So I see that these 2 pieces can be done with an S2 interchange, and then I can do this as my insertion. So the most intuitive comm to me for this would be to insert this here, and then do my S2 interchange, and then just undo the comm, because that's how comms work. But that's obviously really bad, because S2s are very difficult to finger trick fast. The speed optimal commutator for this case, where you're going from UF to LU to RD, is instead doing a setup of R prime FR, and that sets it up into a different 4-move commutator, which can be solved much faster. And so over the summer, I'm planning to replace a lot of my bad comms with slightly better ones that can be executed faster. I haven't really done many time solves yet, my fastest only being 2 minutes and 26 seconds. For reference, that's over a minute slower than my M2 OP PB, because I'm instead focusing on making sure my commutators are actually okay and they're not terrible for me to use, and then I can start doing full solves and developing good habits with those comms. If you want proof that I'm not just making all of this stuff up, I have a video linked in the description that is an example solve of me doing 3 style. It's going to be unlisted, so yeah. Watch that if you care. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching and goodbye.